Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. More years ago than I care to remember, Redeemer was assigned a seminary student to help train in the ways of church during her first 2 years of classes. Her name was Heather, and one of her assignments was supposed to be a project that she could design and put in place during her time with us. I suggested to her that she should develop a tour of our sanctuary, and she did. Now that might seem crazy to you. Many of us are in our sanctuary weekly, so why would we need a tour? Well, if you're here at Redeemer, do you know why our baptismal font is a 6-sided hexagon and what that means? Or are you aware of our sanctuary lamp, what that means, and how it conveys all three members of the Holy Trinity at the same time? Why are most altars 39 inches tall? And what is the top surface of the altar called? I'm sure you suspect I could go on and on at this point. What I'm trying to get across is that there's a lot of meaning behind our worship furnishings, and we so often take them for granted. If only we knew, I suspect, if only we knew, we would find our worship enhanced. In our time each morning this week, I want us to talk about some of the major furniture in ancient Israel's tabernacle and take us on something of a tour. You might be surprised at the connections even to today that you will discover. The tabernacle was the first place of worship for this young nation of Israel, and the furnishings in it provided the basis and background of what was eventually put in the temple and to some extent into our churches now. So this seems like a good place to start, and even more so because it was the place that official liturgical worship of God started too. When the Hebrew people were led out of slavery in Egypt, and then got the 10 Commandments, they were instructed to make the Ark of the Covenant to hold the tablets of stone. Since they were moving from place to place as they wandered in the wilderness, they needed a place for worship, and so God gave them instructions for how to build the tent of tabernacling. The whole thing was tents and poles, so when they moved, it could move along with them. But here is the significant thing. The word tabernacle means dwelling place. When troubles mounted, when faith grew weak or weary, you could remember God dwells right here among us. Maybe that's something we don't think about often enough as we look at our churches today. The whole tabernacle was surrounded by a tall fence of cloth on poles, and there was only one entrance. That entrance was facing east, so that as you entered, you were facing west. And this was on purpose to emphasize the difference between worshipers of God and pagan sun worshippers who faced the rising sun in the east. The first thing one would encounter when you entered this open courtyard was the Brazen Altar. This altar, covered in bronze, which was symbolic of Israel for sin. Let's try that sentence again. This altar was covered in bronze, which was a symbol in Israel for sin. This altar was the place where you sacrificed to atone for your sin. Typically, you led your sacrifice in and gave the reins to the priest, who then performed the sacrifice on your behalf. The root word for altar in Hebrew means to slay or slaughter, and alta in Latin means high. So altar is where sacrifice is lifted up. And here we have to think about Jesus lifted on the cross as he is sacrificed for our sin. Scripture is clear that when you give the animal to the priest, the person bringing it is to lay his hand on the head of the animal, connecting the two and removing his sin and guilt to the animal, which was then sacrificed. Part of what all this means is that the only way to approach God is to first be cleansed of our sin and guilt. And when we think about that, we have to remember how, as we gather, the first thing we do is confess our sin, receive absolution, and then erupt into worship and praise in response to what God has done. So, to put all this together, as you entered the tabernacle, you first repudiated the ways of the world, and then, as the very first thing, you admitted before God and to yourself your failings to be who you were supposed to be, or to follow God's way. Then, made clean, you could approach God for worship. It was a powerful way to begin worship. In our sanctuary here at Redeemer, the first thing you see at the entrance to our church is our baptismal font. It serves as a reminder that it is through baptism that we enter the church, but also as a reminder of our need to be cleansed, just like they did in the tabernacle. Washed in the water, we come before God. More about water tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.